Welcome to Wisdom of the Bible channel. Every year, millions of people around the world fill the streets with flowers, altars, and processions to celebrate Corpus Christi. But very few truly know what they're celebrating. What is Corpus Christi really? What are we celebrating on this day? Many believe this feast is just a tradition, but it's not. Corpus Christi was born from a crisis of faith, from a doubt so deep that only God could answer it. And he didn't respond with words, but with blood. Blood that marked a miracle so great that it forever transformed the history of the church. More than 700 years ago, a priest walked along the cobblestone road toward Rome. His name was Peter, and he had left his parish and his life in Prague because of a doubt that kept him awake at night and was consuming him. For years, Peter had celebrated hundreds of masses, raising the host and repeating the sacred words, "This is my body." But inside, a doubt was growing. What if it was all just a symbol? What if Christ wasn't really there? It was a time when the church controlled everything. Temples were filled with the faithful and relics were venerated with tears, but faith was practiced without being felt or understood. And Peter needed an answer, not some theological argument or doctrinal explanation. He wanted a sign, something real that he could touch and feel. So he did the unthinkable. He left behind his town and his parish and set out toward Rome, searching for faith at the tomb of St. Peter. But in the middle of his journey, he stopped to rest in a small town forgotten by time yet filled with mystery. Bulena. This town had a name marked by pain and by miracle. It was the land of Saint Christina. Christina's story began when she was just a child who decided to follow Christ, but her father was pagan and powerful. He ruled the city with an iron fist, and upon learning of his daughter's faith felt it as a personal betrayal and ordered her to renounce Christ. She refused, and then the horror began. They tortured her, beat her, imprisoned her, and threw her into fire. But nothing broke her. Her body bled, but her soul remained intact. Her father, desperate, made one final decision. He ordered her bound to a massive stone and thrown into the depths of Lake Balsena, certain death. But then the impossible happened. Instead of sinking, the stone began to float. Yes, it floated as if weightless, as if heaven itself kept it above water. Christina, still bound, remained there upon the water, alive. And those watching from the shore cried out in amazement, knowing they were witnessing something not of this world. God was there. When the stone was brought back to solid ground, they saw something more. Christina's footprints had been imprinted upon the rock, not as a memory, but as a seal, physical evidence that faith does not die, even when thrown into the abyss. Peter heard this story and felt something stir within him, because for the first time in a long while, he saw a faith that floated when everything said it should sink. It wasn't enough to cure his crisis, but it was enough to push him to take one more step. That same night, Peter decided to celebrate Mass in the city of Bulsa. It would become a Mass he would never forget. The next morning, he rose early. The lake's mist still covered the streets like a thick blanket. St. Christina's story had touched him, but hadn't healed him. His faith continued to waver, and though he prayed, he felt emptiness and silence. Yet the priest resolved to celebrate Mass anyway. He entered the small church with slow steps. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but something inside whispered, "Do it. Just do it." And Peter obeyed with trembling hands. He prepared the altar, spread the corporal, the sacred cloth, placed the chalice, took the host, and began the prayers. The moment of consecration arrived. He gently took the host, lifted it, and with lips still uncertain, spoke the words he had uttered so many times. Hoc estimus mei. This is my body. And then it happened. Suddenly the host began to bleed. First came a drop, then a thin, dark stream of real blood flowing from the bread. Peter didn't know what to do. He was paralyzed. His hands began to stain. The corporal turned red. The blood dripped onto the altar stones, leaving marks that seemed to burn the story into the stone. The worshippers who witnessed it fell to their knees. Nobody moved. They only stared, astonished and frightened. Peter couldn't speak, but his doubt had vanished. Before him, the wound of the lamb was bleeding in his own hands. He didn't finish the Mass. He couldn't. He carefully placed the host on the corporal, and trembling, he walked toward the sacristy. Each step left drops of blood behind like a procession of the invisible made visible. That night, Peter didn't sleep. Early the next day, he took the blood-stained corporal, wrapped it up, and left Bolsena for Orvieto, where the Pope was staying. He walked for days with his heart beating stronger than ever. He had no sermon or speech, but he carried a cloth stained with miracle and a truth that could not be silenced. When he finally stood before Pope Urban IV, Peter fell to his knees, opened the package, and recounted the miracle that had occurred. The Pope listened to every word the priest spoke, examined the blood-stained cloth, and suddenly remembered something that left him frozen. An image returned forcefully to the Pope's heart, and he understood this miracle was no coincidence. A nun had already foretold it years ago, but nobody listened except him. He himself had heard her when he was still a priest, many years before being elected Pope. It all happened more than 600 kilometers away in the quiet cloisters of a convent in Liazge, Belgium, where a young nun named Juliana saw something that would mark her forever. She was only 16 years old when suddenly a strange image appeared before her. A white disc, brilliant and perfect, except for one thing. On one side, there was a dark stain. Juliana was startled. She didn't understand it. She prayed and waited in silence. Days passed, weeks and years, and the image returned again and again, always the same, a circle of light with an imperfection. Finally, in the midst of solitude and penance, she understood its meaning. The image represented the Church. The white disc was faith, devotion, the very body of Christ in the Eucharist. And the dark spot was an absence, a lack, the lack of a feast that would celebrate with joy and glory Christianity's most sacred mystery. The real presence of Christ in the consecrated bread and wine. Holy Thursday existed but was marked by sadness. And Jesus wanted something different. He wanted a luminous celebration, a celebration that wouldn't recall death, but rather the living permanence of the bread of heaven among us. Juliana knew she had to speak, but who would believe her? For 20 years, she kept the secret. And when she finally dared to share it, only one person took her seriously, a priest named Jacques Pantalon. He wasn't influential, just a man who upon hearing Juliana's vision believed, but time passed, and Juliana died in obscurity. Her vision faded and the message was forgotten until the unthinkable happened. That humble priest who believed what everyone else ignored was elected Pope and took the name Urban IV. And when Father Peter of Prague came before him with the blood-stained corporal in his hands, everything rushed back to his mind. The white disc, the stain, it was a direct message from God that confirmed with blood what a young nun had seen decades earlier in her cell. The Pope did not hesitate, immediately summoning the wisest and holiest theologians of his time and sending them to Bolsena to examine the miracle as witnesses. They analyzed the corporal, studied the altar stones, questioned the faithful who had witnessed the Mass, and one by one confirmed what no one could deny any longer. The miracle was real. The Church was quick to give a name to what had occurred. Transubstantiation, a mystery where bread ceases to be bread and wine ceases to be wine to truly become the body and blood of Christ, not symbolically but in a real living and eternal way. When they returned to Oviet, the news had spread throughout the town and crowds began to follow the theologians. Men, women, the elderly and children all wanted to see and believe. And suddenly, a spontaneous procession formed. Upon learning that the relics were approaching, the Pope did something unexpected. He went out to meet the miracle. Urban IV descended from his ceremonial vehicle, walked humbly to the bridge that separated the city from the rest of the valley. And there, before thousands of eyes, he knelt, not before a throne or a crown, but before a piece of linen soaked with blood. The people followed him, the singing rose, and the body of Christ paraded through the streets of Oviedo. Thus was born the first Eucharistic procession. Since then, whenever the Blessed Sacrament is carried in custody through the streets of the world, it is not just a tradition. It is a reminder of that day when the blood of the Lamb traveled across the stones of an altar, shook a pope, and restored to the Church the certainty that Christ is not absent. He is here and continues to walk with us. But when the procession ended and the days passed, the Pope still felt a trembling in his soul. That piece of linen soaked in blood had moved crowds deeply, but he knew that what had just happened couldn't remain just a memory. Urban Ivor knew that preserving relics wasn't enough, nor was telling the miracle story. He needed to ensure the miracle would endure through time. So the Pope decided to declare a new feast to commemorate it. But a date on the calendar wasn't sufficient because a true feast isn't born from a decree. It's born from adoration. Therefore, without delay, Urban IV summoned the greatest theologians, poets, and scholars of his time and gave them a commission: write hymns. Hymns that speak of the body of Christ, that sing the glory of the sacrament and make souls tremble, like one who has seen the blood and like one who has touched the miracle. And so began the hymn that would seal history. The poets started writing, but among them all there was one who stood apart: St. Thomas Aquinas. The day arrived to present their compositions before the Pope, and they began to read them aloud. But when Thomas's turn came, everything changed. He rose slowly, holding a parchment in his hands, and then he began to recite, "Living bread that gives life, bread that never ends, bread of the new eternal covenant, nourishment and peace." Each phrase was a revelation because Thomas didn't write to impress. He wrote as one who had seen the Lamb. What Christ did that time is renewed today as well, and the mystery of his sacrifice becomes goodness. And when he finished, there were no applause. Silence filled the room, and one by one the other theologians lowered their eyes and without saying a word tore up their own manuscripts. They knew no other writing could match the height of that hymn. It was poetry from heaven. From that day on, the louder Scion became the official hymn of the feast of Corpus Christi. And even today, 8 centuries later, it continues to be sung, but there was a problem. Pope Urban IV knew that the blood-stained corporal couldn't just be kept in a box. It was a living testimony. So he ordered the construction of something worthy of the miracle: a cathedral, the Duomo of Orvieto. In the year 1290, architects, sculptors, painters, and laborers began work on what would be not just a temple, but a monumental reliquary. The facade was covered in gold mosaics and sculptures that told the sacred story. And inside, every vault, every column, every ray of light was designed for one purpose: to house the corporal of Balsena. The blood that flowed from the host now had a throne. And to this day, the blood-stained corporal remains preserved as one of the most venerated Eucharistic relics in the world. But the story didn't end in Oviedo. News of the miracle crossed borders, and with it the feast of Corpus Christi began to spread. First in Italy, then to France, Germany, and Spain. Streets began to fill with processions. The Blessed Sacrament was carried in radiant monstrances, and people came out of their homes to worship it. For centuries, Corpus Christi wasn't just a day. It was an entire octave. 8 days of celebration, processions, music, and adoration. Because people understood that this mystery couldn't be celebrated in just a single day. The Eucharist, which had been understood as merely symbolic by many, now burned in the hearts of the faithful as a living presence. And it was called Corpus Christi, which in Latin means the body of Christ. A literal declaration of what we celebrate in this feast: the living, glorious, and sacrificed body of the Son of God. The power of this mystery was so great that centuries later at the Council of Trent, the Church firmly declared that Christ is present in body, blood, soul, and divinity in every consecrated host. And from that moment, the real presence of Christ in the consecrated bread ceased to be just a teaching in catechism and became the visible center of the Church. It was no longer just doctrine, but certainty. But not everyone accepted it. As the Feast of Corpus Christi spread throughout Europe, voices questioning its foundation also emerged. Entire churches began to distance themselves, and today some churches have excluded it from their calendar. They argue that it cannot be Christ, that it's only a symbol, but Jesus was clear, crystal clear. "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever." And when his disciples doubted, he didn't soften the message. He didn't explain it with metaphors. He made it more direct. "Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." You may not understand everything either, and it might seem too mysterious, but there's something you should know. The Eucharist is not a symbol, it's a person. It's Jesus, whole, alive, present. He himself said, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them." In every Eucharist, it's the same miracle renewed through time because the blood of Christ still cries out and still saves. It's a covenant, a pact, sealed with love. And as Jesus said at the Last Supper, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me."
Hello, dear viewers. Thank you for watching our channel, Wisdom of the Bible. I personally invite you to subscribe to our channel. It supports us and helps us create more videos. Thank you, and God bless you.